My friend Mark Mosher has just released one of what I would consider the best classic electronic music albums that I've heard in a long, long time. It's really great stuff. It's very cinematic. The sound design is exquisite, and it really harkens back to sort of the heyday of e-music. I know that a lot of my friends will really be into this album, so I was really excited when I heard it, and there are so many aspects of this and of Mark's work in general that are important that I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to explore it a little bit. And so I called him up, went down into the suburbs of Denver, and we had a discussion, and here it is. So today I'm doing something a little different. This is my first face-to-face interview, conversation, whatever you like to call it. It's pretty strange because I'm used to doing this in my robe, and my interviewee really asked me to put pants on, so I had to do that. I had to honor his request. This week we're talking to Mark Mosher. Mark Mosher is a friend of mine. He lives in an area near where I live, but he's also a pretty phenomenal electronic music activist, is the way I guess I would put it. I hope you don't mind that label. But I say that because he does many, many things. He is a recording artist, and in fact, we're going to talk about his new recording, which is probably one of the best electronic music albums I've heard in the last decade. It's stunning. So when I heard the album, I right away called him up and I'm like, can we do an interview? Because I want to talk about this, man. But in addition to that, he heads the Boulder Area Synth Meetup. He's been involved in Ableton user groups in the past. Most people worldwide would know him as the magician behind the Percussa audio cubes. He has done some amazing videos with those, and so those are pretty widely viewed on YouTube. He runs he has a blog called Modulate This. I knew I would forget something, and that was one of the things. So he has the Modulate This blog, which is kind of a great touchstone for whatever's happening on each day, it seems. I think you're pretty consistent about posting every day, or close to it. So all these things get wrapped up into one guy who, as you can imagine, is very efficient with his time, but also is really dedicated to the craft. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Darwin, and thanks for coming to my secret lair.
It is a cool secret lair, too.
And I love your podcast, so thanks for having me on. It's really great.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. So, as I know you're a listener to the podcast, and as you know, we generally kick off the podcast by asking you to give us a little bit of background. So why don't we start with that?
Sure. I grew up in Colorado Springs. I've lived here a long time, and I started off. I have a picture of me in my feety pajamas playing an old yellow upright piano. So. And my memory of playing was always writing something, not necessarily reading music or playing other people's music, but always noodling around. So I started off there, and then I moved to what is the name of that air organ that had like the button accordion on the left? Not Hammond, it'll come to me. But anyway, my parents bought me one of those organs. And,
right, the ones like with the big fan in them.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
So I started off with that, and Pure Magnetic did a sound pack with those, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, brought back memories. So yeah, I started off on organ, and then as I got older, I started taking organ lessons, so left hand, right hand, feet, and took some guitar lessons, and then I started getting heavily into science fiction films and reading and noodling around with creating my own radio shows. So I never really was one thing. I was always sort of bouncing around, like doing a little bit of music, kind of producing these little radio shows with friends of mine, and dramatic theater
Right.
kind of shows. And I dabbled a little bit with electronics. I got some electronic kits and pulled things apart and wired things together and tried to make bleepy noises and shoot it out the window at my neighbors late at night. So then as I got a little older, my pivotal point for me is my brother got a quadraphonic stereo.
Oh.
Not stereo, but a quadraphonic system, right?
Yeah.
And he got switched on Bach.
Oh.
And
Okay.
like a lot of people, that's the tipping point where you're
Right.
like, there's sort of the day before and the day after you hear that album. And I heard it quadraphonic, and it was amazing. And then from then on, I started becoming really interested in synthesizers. So got my first synth in 83 or 84, whatever year the Poly 800 came out. So I started on digital. I started with MIDI, which kind of shaped me because I'm used to looking through the 2-digit LED. That's where I started. And then after that, I moved on to the Ensoniq Mirage, which has the 2-digit LED, except you're working in hex, right? So I started early on with the idea of being able to sort of envision the architecture of the synth through the 2-digit display.
Right.
And then working it from there. So it was rather abstract, but since I started there, it seems natural to me. So that's how I got going with all this, and I started playing in rock bands, alternative rock bands. I played in this band. We had a great fan base in the Springs. For 13 years, I played in this band called The Head Full of Zombies down in Colorado Springs, and we had quite a fan base, and I played synth, and I sang, and so I was really a rock performer for hundreds of shows, like 13 years of that. I really had a great time, but I also learned how to emulate the sounds of like classic albums, because I had to learn to play Gary Newman leads and come up with the sound and such. So, and then I went on to do, professionally I went on to do some custom composition work for a few years, and sound design for live theater for a big regional theater down in Colorado Springs. And at some point I moved to Boulder about 10 years ago, and I decided, okay, I couldn't do the 2 a.m.s anymore, gigging with the band and all that. And I've always been a fan of like Howard Jones and the one-man act idea, and as synthesizers became virtual and could fit into laptops and were actually reliable and you could take them on the road, I had this idea back in 2009 that I would go solo and try to figure out how to play some of these more cinematic ideas that I started working with as a sound designer and a custom composer, but take that to the electronic music world. And so I started my journey with Ableton and virtual synths and all that. So that's it in a bit of a nutshell.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about sort of like the cinematic or in sound designerly kind of process, because in listening to your new album, I was really blown away by the sound design. And one of the things I wanted to actually talk to you about a little bit is how you approach sound design and the sound design process. Because it's clear to me, first of all, that everyone does it a little bit differently. Because, I mean, I guess now, Berkeley and a few schools will have a sound design for film class or whatever. But in terms of how do you approach patch creation? Mm-hmm. There isn't sort of like a set or academic way of doing it. Everybody finds their own way.
Right.
And clearly, whatever way you found, it works, because it's pretty amazing. How do you approach it? How do you approach choosing the tool that you're going to do the sound design on? How do you approach like getting core material? How do you flesh it out? How do you go through that process?
Yeah, there's sort of a general way I do it, and then there's a way that I pulled together this particular album, right? So there's a history a bit, right? Because when I started in bands, I was doing sound design on hardware since like the Triton and the ESQ1, and so very subtractive, right? So I kind of got into the idea of subtractive synthesis early on, and but as time went on, and I started getting into, the first virtual synth I ever owned was Absinthe. I had Absinthe 1. By the way, just for fun, I installed it on Windows 7 and it still runs. But I got into Absinthe 1, and I think it was because like Howard Jones in a Keyboard Magazine interview was like, I'm using Absinthe. So I got this thing going, and I'm like, it really changed my world to work with Absinthe, because first of all, I love the science fiction aesthetic and just the user interface,
Right.
which is like this alien thing to start with, right?
Truly.
The sounds were huge. I didn't understand it early on, like way back in 2002, and I used it a little more like put the composer hat on, use it as an arrangement tool, write the song, like when I was doing custom composition work for commercials and such.
Right.
And then when I became a solo artist, I really wanted to have my own palette, so I started exploring sound design, and I started getting into virtual synthesizers. And when the first album in the Alien Invasion series came out, which is called Reboot, virtual synths were going nuts. So it was more of like, how do you choose what synths not to use, right? So that album is really different from the most recent album, in that there was this rich set of tools, and it's kind of a studio album. I went in and I was really exploring, like, what could I do if I blend these together? So I was really working at a meta level, if you will. Like I was doing custom sound design, but at the same time I started coming up with the idea of, like, if I take Vanguard and I use 30% of that for the bass, and I mix it in with this other synth, and then I blend them together through time, and then so I was working very meta, very composer, very arranger, and I was definitely doing some custom sound design work back then. This was 2009, but nothing like what I do today. So it's been this evolution, right, where I started off with just a barrage of VSTs, and then tried to get them under control and wrap my head around them. So then as I moved on to the next album, which is in 2010, I Hear Your Signals, I really merged the idea of sound design, live performance, recording, and arrangement to one thing. So I kind of like motivated a bit like by Dark Side of the Moon and Pink Floyd. In that album, what I was trying to do was write a song, rehearse it, use these controllers. That album is the story told from the alien point of view, so I wanted to not be well-tempered, so I'm using audio cubes and theremin, right? And I was trying to, as if I was a band, rehearse the songs, shape the sounds, blur them all together, and I got much more into sound design with that album, and then also controllerism big time, such that I could in one shot simultaneously compose a piece and perform it sections of it immediately. So let's say you take a song on the album, 3 hours in, I would sort of lay the structure out and be able to play an early version of it. So if you came over, I could play part of it for you.
Right.
And then I did that for months and months, and then I would rehearse it and play it out and experiment it and make it richer. And so by the time I went to record it on that album, I hit global record in Ableton with all the controllers running, and then it was sort of meta sound design because I was mixing and matching the custom patches on the fly. So it was very organic, and a lot of those albums, I rehearsed them for months. Those tracks, I rehearsed them for months, and then I recorded like 3 takes, picked my favorite one, tweaked it a little bit, and then I launched it. But I was gigging those songs at the same time, so it was a pretty interesting process. So, a long way around to answer your question, and like for this latest album, why it took so long is I went really deep. I went the opposite of Reboot. I went to a very small tool set, and I said, I'm going to learn this. My goal was to get to like a virtuoso level with certain synths and to force myself to always use them. So like if I said, I really want a bass line or a synth lead, instead of going to I'll pull up the, Silent One or something, which has a lot of good leads, I'm going to force myself to go into Absynth and then figure it out, right? So I'd say, well, it's not quite mean enough. And then I figured out, oh my God, in the filter, there's a feedback circuit in version 5. And then if you go to the feedback circuit, there's ring modulators and wave shapers and things like that. And I started playing around with these things. And so this is a 2-year process. This is 2 years of experimenting with something like Absynth and Zebra to get non-linearity, to get, and then circle back and then try to play it live, right? So that's a long way around for that, but it's really an evolution. It's kind of a blurry thing for me.
Well, one of the things that anyone who's followed your blogs will know is, first of all, we kind of know which tools you're into because you're very open about talking about it during the process of learning the tools, which it's a little bit gutsy because every once in a while what we see is you're like, yeah, I was really into this, and
it's gone.
Right? Which that's, it has sort of like this human awkwardness that makes it, in a way, kind of makes it interesting. But in the end, what were you mentioned Absinthe and Zebra. You used Ace as well,
Yuhi
right?
Ace.
Yeah, Yuhi Ace.
Yeah, and I became obsessed with Absinthe and with Ace last year, like pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
I have custom skins for Ace. I call it the the theme of my albums is this whole alien invasion, and I created this thing called the Outpost skin. So I was convincing graphic designer friends of mine to make knobs for it and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool looking. But
did you kind of do that like because you were in the mindset of this like science fiction world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really I'm a huge fan of bands like Devo and D Antwoord and bands that are all in. The Poly Six.
Right.
They have a mythology. They're all in. They're like for me that means it's sitting in my basement, right? I'm going to skin this thing. So it has this ice. It's like it was buried in the snow for 2 weeks, and I pulled it out, and that's going to change how I write my patches with it, right? So, but Ace is an amazing instrument. It's like $89, and it's so misunderstood. I did this video, which is quite popular on YouTube. It's called Ace Patch Cables 101, I think is what it's called. And all I do is explain like how the patch cables work. And then what you realize is it looks like it just looks like a subtractive synth or something like that. But everything runs at audio rates, all the LFOs, right? You can do so with this. It looks like a 2 oscillator synthesizer. If you patch it right, you can actually get 7 oscillators going, right? You can do slew, you can do. You can get it to bit crush if you use an envelope to run it into an LFO, which then disrupts like the audio. So I got really hardcore with it, and so some of the weird stuff you hear on this album is stuff like that, right? It's stuff that it's non-linearity, right? That's kind of where I was after. So when I press the key, and if I press it slightly, different velocity the next time, it sounds. I can't almost even reproduce sometimes. It's like a range of timbre.
Right, because it speaks differently depending on how you're playing it.
It speaks a little differently, and to me, I built up quite a little library of Yuhi Ace sounds and Zebra sounds, and some of the songs on the new album are done with one instrument. So, for example, I released this Ableton Live sound pack called Sounds from a Distant Outpost a few years back. I used that for one song and only that. And I rehearsed and I recorded it in 2 takes, picked my favorite take, and then I went back and edited it. And I used an Ableton push. I'm really into the push for this album. So that was all field recording. So I guess one thing I like about using your own sounds, and it's not 100% my sounds. If I pull up a sound on a synth and it's a bass line and it's perfect, I'll tweak it a little bit. So I'm not like a purist about it, but at the same time, as you're trying to tell your story, only you know what you're trying to say sonically sometimes, and you have to have the skill to be able to do that.
Well, especially when it's an instrumental album. I mean, so what's interesting is you have these three albums. They tell this alien invasion story in a fairly understandable way. I mean, you have to catch the setup from the CD cover or the booklet or whatever, but I mean, it's clear that what you're doing comes across. But most band scenarios would say, well, that comes across in the lyric makeup, and you instead approach. This is where I think the sound design thing is important, because that sound design kind of is an abstract version of the lyricism of the album. And I think it's pretty incredible, because as I was listening through the album, one of the things that really came to the forefront was, it's clear to me that not only did you do a lot of your own sound design and your own patch creation, but a lot of the things that you created were specific to the song. And one of the places where I noticed it a lot was where there would be rhythmic devices built into the patch that would like fill a specific spot, right?
Yeah.
And so like to accomplish an album, this album has this like an incredible number of sounds. I mean, how many different sound creations did you make to be able to support that effort?
Yeah, and it's also, by the way, you start with the bass sound, and then I don't stop, and then I add effects, right? So it's and some of the effects are custom as well.
Oh, sure.
So, for example, I was just looking at the Ableton. By the way, I recorded the whole album, except for one song was all recorded and produced and mixed in Ableton Live 9, and through the various versions. I started the album in 2010, right? One song was written in 2010, and all the way up till last week I wrote a song. So Ableton's been the core, except there's one song that was done in Machine.
Okay.
Yeah, which so I totally forgot what the question was now. Sorry, I segued up myself.
So like how many sounds did you create specific for its little spot in the album?
Right. So what I would typically do is some of these tracks, there's usually about 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 tracks of virtual instruments.
Okay.
Each of those tracks has probably got 5 to 8 other devices on the tail end of it.
Sure.
Right? So what that allows me to do is if I'm playing something, you'll hear there's a sound design element that is persistent through this album, and it sounds almost like a rattlesnake, but it isn't quite a rattlesnake.
Right.
So it starts on the first song, it's in the very last song, it's in a lot of the songs. So the idea with this song is, you're a hybrid being and it's evolving. So there's also, for me, the story writer here, there's this conversation going on between both sides here until you become completely evolved, where there's like these weird dream states, and you'll hear the host being talked to by the invader, if you will. So what you'll hear is you're listening to these songs, these weird like dream transitions that happen. Like right in the middle of the song, I'm riffing out, and all of a sudden, wham! There's like this really strange part, right? So it's to hold up the story. So that like little rattling thing represents like it's kind of like machinery in biology and alien biology, and in order to pull that off, I didn't use the same instrument every time because I wanted to use a different instrument as the album evolved to show like an evolution in the sound. So there's a notion of I need this thing that rattles, but it has to evolve so by the time you get to the end it has a different sound than in the beginning.
Right.
So I start off with maybe something going through a series of chains of like maybe it's a percussive instrument like zebra. I'm doing some really weird arpeggiator that's running really fast, and then I wrap that with a delay, and then actually like with a distortion plug-in that has banding so that it distorts at different frequencies, and then I run that through a delay, or I reverse it such that the delay, especially if you get feedback in your delay, it changes with the harmonic content of what goes into the distortion.
Right.
So then you get really weird, it evolves, right? So it's not just like this rattling thing. So what I wanted to have happen on this album is that if you heard that, and you hear me say this on the podcast, you're going to go back and listen to that piece, and then you're going to go back and listen to it again, and you're going to, like the third time, you'll hear like that little change, So I spent like 6 hours on that. So I hope people like it, because it's like became obsessed with, because that's a character in my story.
Right.
It's like Darth Vader walks in, he has a theme. There's this character of this thing that's always present in this album, and it's like this rattling, weird, mechanical, biological thing.
So I have to take a little side journey here to talk about this theme, because first of all, and don't take this wrong, but when you talk about it, it sounds like you could well be like formulating the next Scientology, right? And but it clearly comes from a passion. And you said before how you have this passion for science fiction. You talk about it a little bit in the booklet for the album as well. But what is it about science fiction? And you're not the first person to tie science fiction together with electronic music. But for you, what makes that connection? What is it that, when you're working on a synth, makes you think of this like sci-fi realities? And conversely, when you're thinking of a sci-fi alien invasion, makes you think of a musical theme?
Yeah, well, for me, it started when I was a kid. I used to watch, for anybody who lives in the Denver area, we had these things called the creature features and then sci-fi flicks, right? So when I'm a little kid, my parents let me stay up really late, and when I was a kid on Friday night. So Forbidden Planet, The Crawling Eye, all these things, right? So it was all about the theremin. And so what you'll hear in these pieces, there's a theremin character to it. But I'm not trying to be a thereminist, really, right? I'm trying to... One of the challenges I have with this album, with all these albums, is I want to nod to these things. So I'm interested in, like, honoring the films that really inspired me, telling my story, giving a nod to something without pulling you out of the play, if you will, or breaking the fourth wall. So if you hear, like, on Reboot, there's a song called They Walk Among Us. That's as close as I skate to, like, breaking my theme, because it's very 50s in a lot of ways.
Right.
But so to me, it's really about... I came to it because that was the sound of the movies I was watching. Mm-hmm. And then when I decided to tell my story, I wanted to go, I was profoundly affected by, like, The Outer Limits.
Right.
And the theme for The Outer Limits, and it scared me. And I can remember when I was like 5, I went over to a neighbor's house and Dark Shadows was on, and that theme came on and just scared me to death. And so to me, another edge to everything I do is there's a gothic edge to it. Mm-hmm. So it's gothic science fiction kind of mix, and I think a lot of people are drawn to it because synthesizers are kind of the sound of science fiction. At the same time, what I'm trying to do with my stuff is to go as big as I can go with it, right? To really go all in with it. And I was just talking to someone on Facebook today. Something that reminded me of this. I really got into that album by Tangerine Dream, the soundtrack for The Sorcerer, way back in the 70s.
Yeah, that was very influential for a lot of people.
Yeah, I never saw the film.
Yeah,
until last year.
Oh, did you really? You watched that?
Yeah. So I've like had this story in my head. I listened to this album over and over for decades, and then finally I saw the film, and I'm like, that's not what this is.
Right there.
So I kind of feel like, that's what I'm doing here. I'm trying to write a soundtrack for a film that hasn't been released, and then I give you enough hooks to let your imagination run wild. And I have beat-driven songs in there so that if you aren't into any of this stuff, you're going to dig it.
Right.
And if you are into this, you're going to like the science fiction aspect. But if you're one of one of our colleagues in the sound design performance side of things, are going to really enjoy the sound design piece.
Yeah, well, now it's interesting that you talk about sort of having these homages to sci-fi music styles from the past, not only the imagery and the sort of mental process. But what's also subsequently interesting to me is how over the course of these last 3 albums, how you've changed. I would say that listening to like Reboot and some with Signals, but especially in Reboot, there's a sense to which you can listen to that and say, I can imagine this guy in sort of like a power pop band doing Depeche Mode tunes or whatever, right? This album sounds to me like you hit Vangelis over the head and took over, right? It's a really different thing, and I'm impressed by that and a little bit surprised.
Yeah, I was hoping to surprise some people with this.
Yeah, it was a total shocker to me. But what was really interesting to me is having known you for a while and talked about, where you come from, how it seems like a lot of your most influential people don't actually make an appearance on this album.
Yeah, so it's funny because I have a book over here on the table that my wife gave me called Steal Like an Artist, and it's one of the concepts in this book is to see through the eyes of the person that is your hero, but don't try to emulate them, right? So this is going to sound kind of weird, but you could hear in Reboot Depeche Mode. You can hear Gary Newman.
Right, very much, yeah.
You can hear a little bit of you can hear a little bit of Forbidden Planet. You can hear the references is not so subtle in some of these albums, and it's a Red Rocks album. I came out of playing in rock bands. I played hundreds of shows in rock. and lead synth and just playing really loud. And I was like, and the funny thing about that album is I actually floated 2 singles. This is back in 2009.
Uh-huh.
I floated Midnight and this is how fast things turn on the internet, on soundclick.com.
SoundClick.
That was like the thing, right?
Right.
Soundclick.com, I floated that song, and I floated another song. And Midnight just like took off. Like literally, Midnight went to #1 in the entire electronica category for all of SoundClick. That's what at the time, like 230,000 songs or whatever, hit #1. And I'm like, okay, I'm throwing that other song out, I'm starting this album, and I'm gonna go down the road. So I didn't actually have the theme back then. I had a song, and I'm like, I've got a song, I've got a palette, but it would be really interesting if I put a story behind it. And that's when I wrote the next song, which was Stealth. And then I'm like, holy crap! I'm reliving my days as a custom composer, and I'm writing chase music, and this is pretty neat,
Right.
And then I'm like, well, the next song better be pretty back into the science fiction world. So I shift gears and I go to They Walk Among Us, and then it starts to get really weird, and it becomes more like you get to tracks like Infected, and Now You're Where I Am Now. That's like a telling of where I was going to end up, but I wasn't as mature with it, right? I was just kind of finding my legs as a solo artist, and I think now it's really about, you might be surprised by this, but it's about, I've listened to a lot of guitarists to get to this album. I was listening to, I didn't listen to Dark Side of the Moon for like 8 years. I just purposely didn't listen to it. And then I pull it out and listen to it fresh again, because you only get to do that a couple times in your life, right? And I was like, wow, the textures in this, and I'm not trying to emulate Dark Side of the Moon, but I'm like, there's room. You can hear the movement, you can hear the harmonics, you can hear, there's a special, everybody knows it's special, it's the best-selling album, but I kind of got in touch as a sound designer with, like, reverse engineering, like, a little bit, like, what was happening for me. And then I took that forward and said, I'm going to try and do something that you could dissect it and look at it at that level. And that meant a 2-year walkabout. Right,
well... Yeah, I think, frankly, those first 2 albums kind of came in pretty timely rush, and I think when number 3 didn't come out, I think everyone was like, well, maybe he's on to 15th century romance.
That's right.
Or something, I don't know.
It was all about a new age piano for me.
Right. But it's interesting that you talk about a guitar, and particularly David Gilmour. I was a guitarist before I took up synthesizers, and people used to always be like, oh, who's your favorite guitarist? It's like Eddie Van Halen, huh? Or it's like Jimi Hendrix, huh? Or it's like Eric Clapton, huh? And I was like, no, the person that I loved was David Gilmour because of that space thing. For him, it was never about showing off his playing, even though he's a skilled player. It was more like the tonal character. And so for me, when I made the shift from guitar to synthesizer, it felt really natural because it was sort of an extension of that kind of thought process. So it's interesting that was kind of influential on his album. I would say it shows because, again, what you did was you created a really large soundscape, but one that has space in it. And that again is, when I think of why is it that in my head I listened to this and almost immediately was like, I haven't heard anything this good in 10 years. And it was because it simultaneously had complexity and it had space. And that's something that's really difficult to manage, to marry those two things. Excuse me.
And by the way, so just to give him, I wasn't trying to emulate Dave Gilmour. I was trying to emulate the notion of
right.
Understood. But there's a 4-bar phrase in Act Natural that sounds a little like David Gilmour.
A little bit, huh?
Yeah, I put it in there. I like to put the little... There's Easter eggs all over inside this album if you get into it, and I wanted to have this... And another thing I did in this album is I put in an idea, and then I left it. I didn't repeat it. So you'll hear this thing that comes in, and you're like, when's that coming back?
Right.
And the answer is it isn't. Yeah. So like the last, second to last song, is... I wrote this intro and I wrote this like riff and I'm like, this is awesome, and then it's over. Oh, and I'm like, it serves the story. I like it. And then when I was testing the track in my car, And I got to the end of it, I'm like, I'll just play it again. So,
Right.
I'm like, there's really weird arrangements on the album too, and there's also really weird.
That is true. The arrangements are again really an ode to almost cinematic composition rather than lyrical or song formatted stuff. It really does play like a soundtrack for an album.
Yeah, I did things like I started a phrase melodically and I ended it with a sound design element.
Right.
Or I took a melodic phrase and then I played that same phrase on a different instrument and I shifted it a bar. And you don't notice it at first, but like about 2 bar, like maybe like, I don't know, a bar into this maybe 8 bar phrase, you hear this sort of counter melody, but not really. And then right when you think I'm going to like resolve, I don't. And
right.
So I actually was in there. I did do some editing after. So it's a mixture of sequencing and playing live over the top. There's a fair amount of live play, 1 or 2 takes over the top of the rigid driven stuff because it's supposed to represent machinery versus biology, right? So, but there's a lot of really weird where I spent hours sort of saying, I want to say this melodically, but I don't want it to be so clear. I want you to have to lean in a little and pull it out.
And so this is where sort of like your self-rehearsal became really important then.
Yeah.
So talking about or continuing the discussion about sound design, one of the things that I think happens for a lot of people that really get into sound design is they end up making something and they release it, and it's a tour de force of sound design, but you can hardly hear any of it because it's a great big blur of stuff, right? So you've done a good job in arrangement and composition of building in space and openness so that these things kind of speak out. But the other thing I noticed from reading the album information is that you had this professionally mastered.
I did.
Which is something that is actually quite a rarity anymore. Most people feel like they have the tools at hand to be able to do a credible job of mastering, and so they do it themselves. I'm curious, within the context of electronic music, what it is about the mastering process that you were looking for, if you feel like it was successful, and how you interacted with the mastering engineer. Because quite frankly, in many of the cases, unless you have a mastering engineer that is comfortable with electronic music, a lot of them will attempt to take sort of like the standard mechanism by which they produced they mastered the last ZZ Top album.
Exactly.
And apply it to your electronic music, and it sounds horrible.
Yeah, there's a bit of a let's drop the same chain on on every album.
Right, because that's the chain that worked. That's the chain that got me to where I am today. And it doesn't really work for a lot of electronic music.
Yeah. So interesting. Right before we get to mastering, I've worked for 3 years writing the songs and working on the sounds, etc. And then I decided I was going to make an album in January. Right. So it took me about 20 some elapsed days because I'd rehearsed it and played it and to record and mix it. That's just me. Now, I knew I was going to hire a professional mastering engineer, which changed everything for me. When I did Reboot and I Hear Your Signals, I mastered it myself, and that let me cheat because I would put a mastering plugin on the end of the chain as I was composing.
Right.
And then I could take that out live and instantly play it, and it would be pretty reasonable. And I started that on Reboot, and I felt like I should continue that on I Hear Your Signals so they sounded like the same album, and they were released so close together I wanted you to be able to hear them back to back. Yeah. But on this one there was a huge break. And also because of the Boulder Synthesizer Meetup and because, kind of gathering the tribe in Boulder, I'd met a lot of people, and I met Gannon Kashua, who was the former director of digital media at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And he now works for Universal Audio. He used to work for Digi. And he is amazing, and I've heard some of his work, and I got to know him really well. He's a friend of mine. And when I put out a horror soundscape a couple years back, it was all over the map. I mean, the subharmonics were out of control. I really needed him to reel it in, so that was my first experience with him. But this album is much more, there's a lot more finesse going on in this album. So why I wanted to mention the mixing first is that I mixed without the net this time for the first time in a long time, and it changed everything. I had to think about all the energies before I sent it to him. I wanted to have a huge dynamic range without using compression.
Right.
So I spent, I don't know how many hours in the 20 whatever elapsed days getting it absolutely perfect, and then realizing, oh my God, I can't figure out what's taking me over the edge. Why am I distorting? And I'd find out it was this breathy little thing that was just tip you
just
right
enough, yeah.
So I had to surgically, before I even handed it off to mastering, I surgically worked it. And one of the advantages of hiring a professional mastering engineer is I didn't really worry about my overall loudness level. I was going for dynamics in a dynamic range and wanting to achieve that, right? So I started off by hand mixing it without cheating, without having anything at the chain. There was nothing in my master chain. So that was quite fun, actually, and interesting to do. And then when I handed that off to Gannon, he's used to mixing for IMAX and mixing for planetarium shows, and it's a perfect choice for my album because I'm trying to go big in cinematic. So I hand him this stuff, and he was like, "This thing is huge," and he hands me back the first round of mastering, and I listened to it on a big system, and it was awesome. It was so awesome. And then I took it to my wife's car, which has subwoofers and really nice JBLs, and I thought parts were going to fall off the car. And I'm like, "Hey, Gannon, this is incredible, but I don't think it's going to scale." Right. So this is why you need a professional, because then he's saying, "Well, here's what I put, here's the chain I used," and and we get into this whole conversation, and he's talking. He has as much passion around that chain and the custom chain he made for me as I do for Absinthe, and he's talking all about what he did in this particular song, and then ultimately we tweak off and we roll off whatever it is, 38 hertz at the bottom. He surgically moves it around, and we test a couple more versions, and I'm running around playing it on big systems and in the car, to the point where I think it won't rattle the parts off your car, but it'll still sound epic on a huge system. So there's no way I could have done that. He has as much time in doing his craft as I have doing mine.
Sure.
And the results are really clear. So I recommend everybody find a mastering engineer who understands electronic music and who also, appreciates what I'm swinging for the fences for a cinematic effect here. I need somebody who has experience with that and who understands that this is not a rock album.
Right. Yeah, well, it's clearly the end result hit what you were shooting for, this idea of being really epic in scale, but still it works on systems. So I've got a lot of different speaker systems at home, as well as listening to it in my car and stuff. And I was really amazed. And it really is the hallmark of a well-mastered album, that regardless of where you play, it has the same emotional impact. Whether it's on a laptop speaker or headphones or, a 7-channel auto or car system or whatever, that it works in all those places. And that certainly is the case with this piece. It's again, sonically quite amazing. Well, so that was really cool.
One of my favorite parts about the mix and what Gannon did with the mastering is, while I was preparing all the artwork, because I did all the artwork myself, I had it running at a really low volume just on my computer speakers, and it was that sounds pretty good, Yeah. And I had a few of people who are really into my music tell me they've had it just looping since I launched it. So that's I told Gannon I wanted the first 2 songs. Why I went beat driven is so you could. That's your human calibration level. If you set to your tolerance on those 2 songs. Right. Then you never have to touch the volume knob again. Even for the quieter stuff, you should just let it be quiet.
Right. All right. Well, let's talk about how this translates now into your performance process. Because one of the things you talked about with earlier albums is that you could practically pick up the machines and laptop and set it in front of a crowd and perform much of what you did. This doesn't sound like it could be that thing. But you're saying that maybe it is.
Some songs are, for sure. Like the first song, Dormant. I like that song. It's the first song in the album. I wrote it in 2010. It's a funny, bizarre situation. I finished I Hear Your Signals, and I'm going to go play my first festival as a solo guy at the Electro Music New York, and I pull a little house party together, and all I've got is I hear your signals, right? That's whatever, 8 songs. And I'm like, what if they like it and I have to play one more? So, like, what if? So I wrote the song Dormant at the time, and it was written, I played it on keyboards. And then when I got a machine, I moved it to the machine. And then when I got a push, I moved it to the push. And the arrangement has changed, and I've played it in all sorts of different forms. And what happened by the time it got to the album, if anybody hears, there have been some live, bootlegs recorded of it's like super badass now. And it's like, I've played this song. It's my blister in the sun. You know what I mean? It's like
right.
I've played this song more than any other song probably I've ever played, and I love it just as much as the day I played it back. This one I can play live, and how I did it is I moved it to the push in 2 hours. I had it working, and then I rearranged, I reorchestrated it. I changed the sounds, and I was inspired by the controller to add some new ideas. And so all the guitar stuff that's in the second half of the song is played live. And I played it live a lot, and then I sat down in the studio and took a deep breath, and I recorded 2 takes. And the second take was like, I was like, this is so cool, and I'm like backing it up, and the minute I was done, I'm like sending it to cloud backup. I'm like, I'm never gonna get that again. Right. And to me, that's what's cool about some of the sound design elements that I'm working with, is that it sounds a little different every time I play it, and that's the one. I recorded that take, and I was just like, woohoo! Right. This is awesome.
It's a keeper.
It's a keeper. Right. So, yeah.
So the push has really become a big performance tool for you. I know the audio cubes remain an important part of your performance stuff. Also, you use the Tenorion.
I do still, yeah. It was my first controller.
Last time I saw you play, you were using a Livid
bass.
Livid bass, right? I see. Oh, the poor Novation has been.
It's demoted.
It's been demoted to the lowest shelf.
Yeah,
But up on the upper shelf, we see one of the new Nord. Is this the Nord
Lead 4?
Oh, this is the Lead 4. Okay, all right.
Which was introduced in 2013.
Yeah, as well as the Octatrack.
Correct. So
you have more buttons than God at this point.
I do, yeah. So I've changed my set through time. So when I played 2009, 2010, I was using Tenorion, Audio Cubes, Theremin, Pitch to MIDI, and the Novation controller. And then last year, I added interactive visuals because I wanted to tell my story of the alien invasion, and I wanted to have an invader cam.
Right.
And I want to give a shout out to Tim Thompson, who was a huge influence on me and pushing me to Resolume, and knowing that I'm a synthesist, I'm not a visual programmer. Right. And he knew that I wanted to tell a story with it. And he was visiting, came out to the Boulder Synth Meetup, and sat down with me, and some few little things he said to me just tipped me over, and then I was off to the races with it. And so that became, I had to manage that now. I had to run a system, and I use Ableton Live. So what my design goal was, I don't want to change any of my controllers, but I want to have interactive visuals. So Live is still the hub, and then it talks through to the Resolume system.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So then I added Resolume, and then I had some Theremin mishaps falling. My Theremin.
Yeah, I noticed. I don't even see the Theremin. It's like you have it hidden from human view.
Yeah, the Theremin is the Theremin does make an appearance 2 times on this album in unusual ways, but so for the just for the 2014 rig, and I'm actually going to start on this tomorrow. But my plan is to use replace the Novation and as a controller, and use the Nord Lead as a controller, and as a synth, and use the Octatrack, and use the Tenorion, and I will use Audio Cubes as well, but in a different way than I've ever used them before. So my rig was sort of boxed. I had 2 sight lines.
Right.
And now it's not boxed. I've got 2 cameras instead. So it's freed me up to have the push is going to be there, rocked forward, and you can have that. And then if I'm playing on the keyboards more traditionally, like I used to do in rock bands, the camera's going to pick me up from the side, so I don't have to have as much rig demands on the other end, right? So in borrowing gear. But why I'm doing this is that I had a profound, I had this epiphany in 2013. I bought an Octatrack. And the Octatrack does not appear on the album directly, but the spirit of the Octatrack and trying to learn something very deep and getting morphing into sound design is going to be a big part of what I'm going to be doing in 2014 live. So my plan is to anchor my live set with songs from the new album, and in the middle of those anchor points do complete improvisational work on the fly. And so talk about the walkabout, I spent the last 9 months doing nothing but practicing Octatrack, and now practicing Nordlied feeding the Octatrack, and being able to do something entertaining, plus be a sidekick to a superhero player, right? So that I can use the Octatrack to resample them. So why these instruments are profound to me is they morph. I can smoothly interpolate between hundreds of parameters. So as a sound designer, I can make decisions live rather than working through a modulation matrix. And so I want to really bring this idea forward and challenge myself in 2014 to anchor the set with stuff that you hear on the album, but in the middle, try some without a net sort of live sound design work with morphing.
Well, that should be great, because if there is any justice in the world, your album is going to certainly become well known. I feel that strongly about it, and so having that available as sort of the anchor point, but to be able to do these improv things on top is really cool. But one of the things that you said really kind of tweaked me, and it's something that actually goes back to one of the first things you said in your background, which is that when you first started learning keyboards and piano and stuff, you did so by noodling around versus taking the traditional, read from the John Thompson and the John Shams books, until you finally get sick of it and give it up to play baseball, right? Which is cool, but that I think that downplays the fact that somewhere along the line you learned how the practice of practice.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know, was this something that you just did naturally? Is it something that really developed, the mechanism for practicing developed when you were in the band? Or how does that work? Because frankly, electronic music and the incredible tools that we have available to us right now, sort of like imply that you don't have to practice. Mm-hmm. All the cool stuff's right on the surface. Really, it is. Now, I think you take something like the Octatrack, and it's such a deep system that if you just do the stuff that's obvious from the front panel, you're going to miss an awful lot of the capability of this machine. And I think that's probably the case with most electronic music systems, but most of these systems are made so that you don't have to spend 9 months practicing them. So why would you put yourself in a position to do that? Or why is it important? Why is it important to you to take that approach to it?
Yeah, well, back to how I've always sort of been my personality type. I'm self-taught. I like to read a lot. I like to noodle around. When you mentioned, you sort of joked that I buy and sell gear. Every piece of gear I get is a lesson. It's like taking a course in a university or something like that. So, for example, I bought an Ultranova. I like the Ultranova. There was just too much overlap in some of the other things I had, but I'm glad I owned it. I learned some things about the art. Every instrument has its own character a little bit, right. and it started me down the road of morphing because it had sort of the morph buttons, right? So I think, though, why learn deep instruments? It's an interesting question because Ableton Live itself is deep, and Live is so deep. No one, I suppose, could say they know it all because there's so many parts. Unless you're some certified trainer or something like that. I know the parts I use really well, and I think of Ableton as an instrument, and it's super deep. And if I turn around and try to explain it to somebody who's never seen it before, they'll just glaze over.
Right.
So I'm attracted to technology that the more you give in to, the more energy you put into it, the more it gives back.
Right.
So it has to be deep at a certain level, such that I'm always surprised and I'm always learning. And Octatrack's like that, Ableton's like that, Max for Live is like that. I would say Absinthe is like that, Zebra. Yuhi Ace seems simple on the surface. It's very much like that. You move a cable, oh my God, what just happened, right? So, and I think for me, anyone can grab. Again, I'm not a purist about it. If you use a sound pack and it helps you get your contextual idea down, that's awesome. But you got to get to the sound design element with at least one instrument, such that you can speak through it. And just like David Gilmour speaks through that, the black, the guitar, the Strat. You have to speak through something. And I just sort of came to that realization like 3 years ago that I was too wide.
Right.
And so for me, I speak through Absinthe and Zebra and Ace, and I'm also, by the way, a big fan of Tone 2's products. So Electra X is a massive, huge synth that I'm very, very familiar with. But Octatrack was an interesting challenge because sometimes I want to be off the computer. I'm on the computer a lot. And sometimes I just want not to be on it. And there was a promise behind the Octatrack that it would be like Ableton in a box. And that's just not true. It's its own thing. It's its own animal. And then when I got it, I know there must a lot of people must be frustrated. They get it and they try to load the sound into it and it doesn't really do anything or whatever. And you have to push through. It's like veils of consciousness. All of a sudden you're like, the light bulb comes on and you're like, oh man, this is amazing. I've never done anything like it. And if you see my early videos with it, like back in the summer, I did this video where I loaded 4 sounds into it. And I played it for 20 minutes, and I was just like barely touching the slider, and it has, there's no velocity, anything on it. It's all about morphing parameters and manipulating the parameters in real time. And I find it like extremely expressive, even though there's not a velocity button on it.
Right.
And it's more like you take a guitar like Jimi Hendrix and you bend the neck. Right. Working with a deep instrument like an Octatrack is like you're bending the wood.
Right.
You're not just hitting the string. If that makes sense.
So for the people who will have heard this and ran out and bought an Octatrack and then immediately put it on the bottom shelf because they can't figure it out, what were the things that helped you break through on that?
I think it was. It's funny because how I got to the Octatrack is I got the analog
Analog 4.
Analog 4. It never had an Electron piece of gear, and I got the Analog 4. And then once I started getting into the trig programming stuff, I was like, this is amazing. But I'm like, I wanted more sonic range, and I really wanted to do. I'm really getting into music concrete and using samples, and I've kind of come back around where like samples aren't just this static rompler thing to me. They're like a piece of content that I can really bend and change and get really bizarre results out of, and I just find it really satisfying. So I think that it was for me it was like you got to get through the mechanics of the first. It took like 2 weeks just to sort of be able to load something and then all of a sudden you grok it and then you take off. So what I would say if you buy an Octatrack, first of all you're in for a deep. If it takes as long to learn the Octatrack as it does to be useful with something like Ableton Live, so it's not easy. But once you get through that, if you want to use harmonic content that is sample source, it's pretty. I can't do what I do on that with anything else.
All right.
And so, and you and I have done some jams together, and you've pushed me to sort of explore it. And I have to say, it's like I have this like secret desire to become like a virtuoso with this thing and be able to do things with it that no one can do and surprise myself when I use it.
Well, you loaned it to me for that one like long weekend. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it was a long week. I don't know. It felt
seemed like
it went
a week.
Past. It went past quickly, but it was. I had that experience where it was sort of like I couldn't make it do anything, and all of a sudden I made it do one thing.
Yeah.
And just within the parameter, just within the context of that one thing, all of a sudden it was like this world of sound kind of opened up, and I realized, wow, this is true, and I'm just using one of the engines and just one effect orientation, and it was shocking.
And for me, because it can be a mixer and you can process other people through it, it's become a very social instrument for me. Yeah. I think I've had, in 9 months, 15 jams with people.
Wow.
Where I take this little thing over and I figured out how to run it on battery, and I go to your house and we, get a nice glass of whiskey or something going, right? And you fire up whatever you play, acoustic guitar, modular synth,
yeah, right.
trombone,
like
theremin.
The 2 times that I did it was like modular synth once and a classical guitar the other. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so it's
Just
to me
that.
it's about performance, right? It's
Right.
a great performance collaboration instrument. It's very social. Whereas I find Ableton without the push, I'm getting better with it with the push, but it's it's more of like the tool for me to get my idea out. And I feel like I have this really nice complementary setup. So I've got like Ableton and push, and I've got a morphing synth and a morphing sampler, and so bringing these out in 2014 is gonna. Well, I'm ready to see what these babies can do, and how the audience reacts to it will be interesting, because half the time I'll be doing something that's like performance interesting, and the other half it's going to be sonically, I think, really different. So I don't know how people will take it, but I think you have to push it. You have to go for it.
Indeed. So, and I didn't mean to imply that you turned over equipment too often.
Hey.
What I more was talking about earlier was this idea that we see when you turn gear. You don't actually turn gear that much, and you certainly do beat the hell out of it before it goes. So I have this sense that every time you sell something, your sales note has to be like, there's places where there's a lot of grease on the keys, right?
Well, I'm pretty. I keep really good care of everything, because I'm not sure I'm going to sell it or not.
Well, what do you think is in your future? Where do you think things are going to go for you? Because it seems like you have a trajectory, although it's not exactly clear, because you maintain this controllerism thing. You're heavily into soft synths, but you're playing around with some hardware options as well. What do you think the future direction for you is?
I think for me, it always comes back to story, and then trying to tell some sort of story in a live show. And it's interesting because I hadn't really been into hardcore, into Ableton, until I went to mix this album down, and then I felt, you fall back in love with these things again, and now it's sort of, I was actually thinking about doing something even more minimalistic in 2014 until I started working on the album, and I'm like, this is just so fun, I've got to do it live. So for me, it's, I would like to figure out how to blur it more, to get interactive visuals, hardware synths, software, all working together and set up quickly and fly around easily, and have some... get out there and be, I don't know, I just like the blend of composed with improvised, improvise, that's a weird way to say it, with improvised music, right? So I don't know what the future is. I think that, I think you have to, I know I've sort of stopped chasing plugins, I can tell you that. I used to do, for many years, and you saw it on my blog, hey, check this plugin out, oh my god, have you checked this plugin out? And same thing with the iPad, and I'm not downplaying the impact of the iPad, but for me it was like, I'm so into VSTs. It was I see where they're heading with it, and I think it's going to be great. But I'm too tangible with what I do, because I played in rock bands, so I need to be able to, in the dark or with a blinding uplight, reach down, find the key or the knob, and turn it, and know I'm going to hit it. So. I have used iPads live, but for me, I think where it's at is performance and expression, live expression, and trying to get that, into the album. And I think the new album for me embraces the idea, because my story embraces this of mechanical plus biological, right? That I can have machine-driven stuff with human stuff over the top and really get some nuanced performance. And so I don't know where it's heading. It's crazy, the options, right? So I guess what I would say is, for me, it's about setting down the rails so that I can focus. And my lesson learned in the last 3 years is to focus on a few deep things and go deep. And I feel like, using Absinthe and Zebra and, some of these tools have really transformed my thinking, right? About what is sound, what is music. And I could never have done it without spending 2 years staring into Absinthe,
Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time. This is a great chance to have a conversation. Great opportunity to do my first face-to-face interview.
Thanks for coming by.
I actually am hoping to do some more of these shortly. But and thank you for your work on this album and for giving me a listen at it. It blew my head away. The name of the album is, again...
Fear Cannot Save Us.
Fear Cannot Save Us by Mark Mosher. It's available on Bandcamp.
It's on Bandcamp and it'll be
iTunes.
It'll be on iTunes and Amazon by the time this goes out, probably.
All right,
and,
awesome.
It'll be everywhere, but Bandcamp's a great place to get it because you get the digital booklet, which I spent quite a bit of time on.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So yeah,
you don't get that with iTunes?
Nope.
Oh wow, that's a drag.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of interesting information in there. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Well, there you go. Everything from the Electron Octatrack to Alien Invasion Theory. We certainly skated it all. If you want to check out Mark's work, both his current album and his earlier albums, you can find more information at markmoshermusic.com. That's MarkMoshermusic.com. He also has a site specific to this new album. It's fearcannotsaveus.com. I strongly suggest you take a look at it and that you get this album. It's really incredible. To me, it has a feeling of such breadth, but at the same time honoring so many sort of classic electronic music concepts and memes. It's incredible. I want to again thank everybody for listening, and I hope you're enjoying it. If you have any ideas for the podcast, always feel free to reach out to me. That's ddg@cycling74.com. It's probably the easiest place to get hold of me. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Thank you.